What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Fifth Down Fantasy Podcast. Now we are officially into our in-season episodes coming out every single Wednesday at 1 p.m. We're going to be giving you everything you possibly need to know for each week, whether it's coverages, matchups, the starts, the sits, whatever you want to call them, players to be looking at for future weeks, everything we all need to know all in one show as fast as humanly possible. But Ben, let's just kick this right off. Let's start with you. We're getting into week one now. I'm sure you're excited as much as I am. Who is the first player that we need to talk about?
I'm really excited this week to watch David Montgomery. I know all of the hype has been on rookie Jahmyr Gibbs, but my projection model has David Montgomery ranked higher in week one than Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think a big part of that is because of how large of a learning curve there is when playing in the NFL. You don't just immediately start producing like an elite running back. First round rookie running backs average 4.5 points in week one. And I'm not saying bench Bijan. I'm not saying bench Jahmyr Gibbs. I recognize that their role is going to be different than, let's say, like Cameron Artis-Payne's, for example. But David Montgomery is good. He's finished as a top 24 running back every single season of his NFL career. And there is a good chance that he's going to have a lot of receiving work in week one, considering his role with the Bears for the past few years. He averaged 2 receptions per game. And I think we all agree he'll have more carries than Jahmyr Gibbs. So I love David Montgomery. I am starting him up as a low-end running back one and have no shame in doing so.
Yeah, and obviously, right, as of right now, Chris Jones is probably not going to be playing in this game. I mean, arguably the best defensive player in the whole league, and missing your star defensive tackle does not help if you're the Chiefs defense against the Lions and David Montgomery. But assuming that the Chiefs are still pretty heavily favored to win this game, and yes, like Jahmyr Gibbs is probably going to see the majority of the passing work, even in the first week. Like, do you worry about game script at all, or do you think this is like a hidden game where it might not look like it on paper, but Montgomery's just set up to star?
I mean, he set up a star because of the matchup. He set up a star because of, I think right now we're at 53.5 points as the total. And I also think, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to see majority of the receiving work, but he's going to own all of the receiving work by the end of the season. So right now, David Montgomery, week one, I think he's going to finish higher than Jahmyr Gibbs.
Okay, wow. Higher than Jahmyr Gibbs. That is a bold take. Another bold take. I think Brian Robinson finishes the top 12 running back in week one. He's playing the Arizona Cardinals, who were the third worst team versus running backs last year. The Commanders right now have the largest favored spread of all of week one. They're favored by 7 points. That is the most of any team, which means a positive game script for Brian Robinson playing against this Cardinals team. One of their head repeat reporters, John Keim, said that Brian Robinson will actually be the 1A to Antonio Gibson's 1B. And I think people forget a lot about the fact that Brian Robinson saw over 20-plus touches in 4 of his final 5 games this year, especially with that positive game script we talked about. I think that he is going to be in for a really big week one.
There's such a small sample size when we talk about Sam Howell, but I do think that there are some exciting things to get excited about with the Commanders' offense. I am actually with you. I really love Antonio Gibson this year. And as a matter of fact, Alex, I know you do too, but I do think that this is going to be a Brian Robinson week, just given what we know about game script. But how are the Commanders going to take such a commanding lead over the Cardinals? Well, one, the Cardinals aren't very good, but the Cardinals also ran one of the highest rates of cover 3 last season. And again, small sample, but Sam Howell was actually second last year in yards per attempt against cover 3. And Jahan Dotson, that is the guy that I think is going to be taking the Commanders to the promised land. He's somebody I absolutely love, and he is my next guy that I'm keeping my eye on with in week one, especially with Terry McLaurin's status up in there with his injury, and without him potentially eating into Dotson's target share. Dotson is just poised for a huge start to start the season. Again, Sam Howell second in yards per attempt against cover 3, which is predominantly what the Cardinals ran last season. I had him projected as like a flex option, but with the touchdown upside, which is shorter regress, but still, this awful Arizona defense, I love Jahan Dotson. I think he could put up a top 24 week.
Is he still a flex, even if Terry McLaurin doesn't end up playing this week? Because it seems like right now there's probably a better chance not that he does end up playing. So are you saying that he's still a wide receiver flex, regardless if Terry McLaurin plays? And if that is true, how high would you be ranking Jahan Dotson if he ends up playing and Terry McLaurin somehow doesn't?
I think that Jahan Dotson's probably like a low end flex option if Terry McLaurin does play, but I'd put him as a low end wide receiver 2 or a high end flex option without Terry McLaurin.
Okay, that's really good to know for him. The next guy that I really am excited about this week is Chris Olave. I mean, again, probably the most hyped up player for me on the Fifth Down Fantasy podcast all offseason, but I think that he's going to get set up for a huge start in week 1, playing the Titans, who were by far the worst team versus wide receivers last year. And the top 2 guys on their depth chart right now are Christian Fulton and Sean Murphy-Bunting, neither of whom are a corner that you should ever be scared about. I know it is the fact that Derek Carr is starting week 1. Maybe there's still a little bit of rust to get off in terms of the Olave to Derek Carr connection, but there's no team better of a matchup that they possibly could have gotten week 1 than the Titans. And I think that Chris Olave is just absolutely going to feast in this game.
Chris Olave, I have him projected as the wide receiver 14 for week 1. The matchup is awesome. The usage is going to be awesome. Remember, he finished as the wide receiver 25 last year. So for us, hyping him up this high, I think already speaks volumes. But how high is the limit for Chris Olave in week 1, Alex?
Yeah, I cannot get enough of him. But is there any other people that come to mind that are big starts? Because we haven't talked about any quarterbacks yet. Is there anyone that sticks out more than another that maybe might be like an underrated quarterback that you can still get on some waiver wires?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Geno Smith is somebody, any league where I missed out on one of the elite quarterbacks, I was immediately thinking to myself, when can I take Geno Smith or Daniel Jones? But this week, Geno Smith, QB5 last season, he's going up against the Rams, who ran the most zone coverage of any team last year. And Geno Smith had the highest completion percentage and the second highest passer rating, just behind Tua against zone last year. Now with a healthy Tyler Lockett, rested up after the offseason, DK Metcalf, even putting JSN in the mix. I know there's some concerns with his health too. Geno Smith is locked in my mind. Definitely has top 5 upside, but definitely QB1 for week 1. I took this from Josh Larkey of the 33rd team. 8 of the Rams' 11 projected starting defenders are either undrafted, rookies, or taken in the 6th round or later of the NFL draft. This is comfortably the worst secondary in the NFL, and Geno should shred what looks to be one of the worst defensive units of the past decade.
Yeah, this is not the same Rams team as it was when Jalen Ramsey was there, and I think that people could be overrating that a little bit in week 1, thinking that that's the secondary they're going up against. But I think that, like you mentioned, that this is not the same secondary of their Super Bowl year just 2 seasons ago. Someone else that I'm really excited about this week has to be J.K. Dobbins. I think this one's a given. It should be obvious, but I don't see people talking about it enough yet. The fact that J.K. Dobbins could end up as a top 5 running back in fantasy this week. This new offense under Todd Monken is, I think, going to make this whole team explode. I was off on J.K. Dobbins at the beginning, but I have come into fruition the fact that he's going to feast, in the matchup against the Texans this week is the absolute best place to do it. The worst team against running backs last year, and they did almost nothing to add to their linebackers. Like usually with teams, when they get beat this badly on the ground a previous year, they do some additions and ways to kind of add to their overall defensive room to at least stop the run game, because that's the word. The football game starts, and they've done nothing to do that. J.K. Dobbins going to feast week 1. I think that he is top 5 upside at the position.
Alex, how come every time I sent you one of my fantasy football drafts with J.K. Dobbins, your response was, I like every pick but J.K. Dobbins?
Yeah, I was just off of him, and I didn't realize until there were a few articles that came out within the past couple of weeks that highlighted that this offense is actually going to be geared towards running backs. Of course, there is the Lamar factor that he threw to running backs the lowest rate in the NFL last year. I don't expect him to all of a sudden start targeting running backs a ton, but I expect him to probably be maybe more closer to a league average rate rather than the absolute bottom of the barrel. And the more that he throws to running backs, the better it is for J.K. Dobbins. And I think that role is something that I don't think I was as privy to as during the offseason, and something that I've started to pick up and regret that I don't have more shares of J.K. Dobbins at this point.
Yeah, that makes me really happy to hear. I've been talking about J.K. Dobbins the whole offseason, especially with Todd Monken. I actually wanted to talk about J.K. Dobbins this week, but there was something that caught my eye. I'm not sure if it sways your opinion at all, But the Houston Texans were top 5 last year in running zone coverage, and Lamar Jackson was bottom 5 in yards per attempt when targeting his running backs against zone. Either way, I do think we're going to see more passes than normal to J.K. Dobbins. So from a volume standpoint, he should be fine. It's the efficiency that worries me. And we know J.K. Dobbins is stellar on the ground. Ravens should get up early and then just run the ball with J.K. Dobbins.
Yeah, I am excited to see what happens, and I hope that the Ravens have the best offense in the NFL. I probably have more shares I've Mark Andrews the most of any tight end, probably in almost half my leagues. Behind Justin Herbert, my second most owned quarterback has to be Lamar Jackson. I cannot get enough of them. But let's go to the negative side of things. Let's talk about some matchups maybe that we don't like, or some certain coverage schemes that some players might play this week that we just are not as in on probably as we should be right now. Who's the first player that comes to mind when we talk about that?
Alex, you and I all offseason have been talking about why we don't like Deebo Samuel. And I don't think people quite heard us. Deebo Samuel is just not primed for a good 2023 season. And especially now in week 1, I would be terrified about starting Deebo Samuel against the Steelers front 7. His only wide receiver 1 year, he saw more than 20% of his total points coming from rushing plays. And I said it before on this show, you will not continue to use Deebo as a wide back after trading for Christian McCaffrey. That's more so his role coming out of the backfield. So my projection model came up with Deebo having 2 rushes in week 1, and the Steelers allowed the 3rd fewest yards per rush against the wide receiver position last year. That's without TJ Watt for half of the year. So now Deebo Samuel, if he wants to get cute with his rushing plays, he has to go up against one of the top 3 defenses that's stopping him, with the 1 year removed defensive player of the year, TJ Watt. Not to mention, we already know that Brock Purdy's favorite targets were Brandon Ayuk and Kittle, who may not play, but still, I just can't imagine Deebo Samuel doing much in week 1.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of boom or bust weeks from Deebo. I think that's what you get as a product of playing in an offense like this with this much competition. And I think there's going to be weeks where people will be blowing up our mentions and telling us that Deebo is the truth and that he's going to have some big games inevitably because that's who he is. But right now, this week, definitely not a Deebo week. We're going to see more inconsistency than consistency. I mean, last week we saw it. Last year we saw it where he had just 3 top 20 finishes in 13 games. I think we see something really similar this week. And it's going to be one of those finishes where he might be ranked inside the top 20 for some people, but definitely not for me. Another person that I think should be downgraded just slightly, this is probably more of a DFS play or a weekly best ball play rather than an actual redraft play, and Darren Waller. This is Darren Waller's toughest matchup of the entire season against the Cowboys. I mean, the Cowboys were a top 2 team versus tight ends last year. They have a really weird defense where they play 3 safeties across the middle, and all the safeties can play linebacker. They can play safety. They have a really weird hybrid defense that is tough enough for any tight ends that didn't see much success versus them last year. And then you throw in the fact that, yes, we've been hyping up Darren Waller all offseason, but it might take a couple games for them to get up to speed. And this is like the worst possible defense that you could go in real NFL live action for the first time against. They had 1 drive this preseason. Darren Waller was targeted over 40% of the time. He's going to have a lot of huge weeks, but this is like the absolute worst case scenario for Darren Waller week 1. I'm not saying don't play him in redraft. You have to, but as far as DFS goes, I think that Waller is looking to be a little bit of a fade for me when he might be a popular target with Travis Kelce potentially out.
Yeah, and I think the thing that we talk about with the tight end position is how it's so desolate. If you drafted Darren Waller, you're probably not rostering any other tight ends. And if you are, it's maybe like Tyler Higbee, who you're like, maybe he's worth a play because of Cooper Kupp's injury. And I don't think that's the case. I think Darren Waller, in fantasy, start him, but in DFS, even as much as I love Darren Waller, I probably won't be betting on him this week, and I'll probably look to hit some overs on some of those other wide receivers on the Giants. I know Darius Slayton, he should have a pretty high number of routes run. Same with Isaiah Hodgins. Those are 2 guys that I think will probably outperform. They'll be heavy waiver guys heading into week 2. And we're going to talk about some of our favorite guys to keep our eye on in just a bit. But before we get to that, Michael Pittman is somebody that I think by all costs, if you do not have to start this man, do not start this man. Anthony Richardson, yeah, he's primed for a pretty good week. but not as a passer, as a rusher. The Jaguars allowed the 8th most yards per rush to the quarterback position last year. And I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about Jahmyr Gibbs. There is a steep learning curve in the NFL, especially at the quarterback position. That is one of the hardest positions to play, definitely in the league, possibly in all of sports. And Anthony Richardson, he's going to have to rely on his instincts on the ground more than anything. He's not going to be able to throw the ball, and if he does, he's not going to be able to do it accurately with these NFL rushers in his face. My projections model has Michael Pittman as the wide receiver 34. And honestly, I think that might be a little bit too high. I am not thrilled at all to throw him in my lineups.
I don't know if you saw this, but right now Anthony Richardson's current season-long prop for passing touchdowns is 17.5. There are 17 games in an NFL season, and his line for over and under passing touchdowns is 17.5. So they're saying that like one touchdown per game, which is not good if you're a Michael Pittman fan. And I know that wide receivers see a higher target share when there's teams that run these run pass option plays, which they're going to run a ton of. But like when your quarterback's season long line is pretty much about one touchdown per game, that is not good for the Michael Pittman fans. I will be fading him the same way that this week I'm going to be fading Alexander Mattison against the Bucs. I'm not very confident in Alexander Mattison for the full season, but this is a really tough matchup. I mean, the Bucs have been as tough as any team against running backs over the last 3 years, and they have a very similar team to exactly what they've had, where this team is led by their super athletic linebackers in Devin White and Levante David. They have a super tough defensive line to start of it, as they kind of have an inside-out defense that's a run funnel. That's been every team under their head coach, Todd Bowles, has been more of a run funnel where they're just not going to beat us by running the ball up the middle or inside, which is a lot of where Alexander Mattison is going to see his work this week. I just cannot get enough of him. I can't get any of him in a really tough matchup versus the Bucs this week.
It's funny. I think that this is going to be a really interesting game for the Vikings. I do not like Alex Mattison. I haven't liked him all offseason. I don't think I have any shares of him, and for good reason. But something that caught my eye was that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers ran last year a top 5 rate of cover 3, where Kirk Cousins had excelled. He was top 5 in yards per attempt when targeting his slot wide receivers. And I love Jordan Addison. Absolutely love him. He is one of my favorite rookie wide receivers because of the offense that he's in. But I do think it might be a while, again, steep learning curve, until he starts earning snaps over KJ Osborne. But I wouldn't be surprised to see either of the two of those have a pretty solid game. Otherwise, I think Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson are the obvious, hey, these are the only two guys in this offense worth starting.
What about, I think I agree with you that this could be a high scoring game. And there's some players that I really like in this matchup. I like Chris Godwin. I really like Rachaad White in this matchup. Again, the Vikings are favored by 6 points. The negative game script's going to favor some more pass catching. The Vikings lost their best linebacker in Eric Kendricks. So I think this is going to be a good week for Rachaad White. But the last thing we have some players that we want to be talking about that all you need to be keeping your eyes on before week 2 starts. Maybe pick them up on your waiver wire now, or just the players to watch. But we all have one game left that we didn't really get to cover yet in the Monday night game. So is there anyone from the Monday night game specifically that you find yourself that you're excited about or not excited about for this coming week? Because this is the Jets-Bills interdivisional matchup. Like, what are you expecting from it?
I think this is going to be probably one of the best games of the week, to be honest with you. I am so excited to see Aaron Rodgers put on his Jets uniform. I'm excited to see if the Bills can pick up where they left off, not to mention, especially with Josh Allen finishing the year with that UCL injury. But Josh Allen, sure, he's one of the three best quarterbacks in the NFL right now, undisputably. But I am staying the heck away from Gabe Davis. Gabe Davis, boom or bust guy, just like Deebo Samuel. But this is not the type of week where I would be comfortable at all firing up Gabe Davis when the Jets allowed the second fewest yards per attempt to wide receivers lined up out wide. That's where Gabe Davis played 90% of his snaps last year. This is one of the best secondaries in the NFL, ranked number 1 by PFF, and they were top 10 in unrealized air yards. Now, why this is important is because Gabe Davis had an average depth of target of 15. That led all of the Buffalo wide receivers, and the Jets allowed just 6.9 yards per play. That is the fewest in the NFL on plays with 11 or more air yards. I have him projected as the wide receiver 35. And Alex, I was mentioning to you pre-show how much I love Van Jefferson. If Van Jefferson is on your waivers, I would be starting him over Gabe Davis this week. I know that might sound crazy, but it's the truth.
Yeah, going back to the Bills Jets game, I think the one player that I'm really excited about in this game is Garrett Wilson. I know Jacob
Yeah.
Gibbs posted this that last year the Bills pressed wide receivers at a rate of 79%, which was like second in the NFL. And even as a rookie, Garrett Wilson like commanded a target at one of the highest rates in the league versus press coverage. Now Matt Harmon of Reception Perception said that Garrett Wilson beat press coverage at a historic rate at a rookie that was only among the absolute elite of the elite wide receivers. You put those two things together with a defense that presses a lot like Buffalo, I think that we're going to see a lot of Garrett Wilson targets early and often for him and Aaron Rodgers. Intimidating matchup on paper, but I think that, again, with how much press the Bills run, this is a perfect matchup for him. Going back to the Bills, though, the one player that I guess we're just not super in on some of this Bills offense this week is James Cook. I know he's not the power back. He's not Damian Harris, who I'd also be avoiding. But last year in 17 games, the Jets allowed just 7 rushing touchdowns. That is not many. That is less than 1 per half a game. And I don't think it's going to be a strong week from James Cook. This is still Robert Saleh, who's the forward coordinator at the 49ers. And similar to the 49ers, they run a similar run funnel where running backs kind of get stuck in the middle and they don't let running backs get out in space, which is a lot of where James Cook thrives. So I'm going to be staying away from him a lot this week. But let's jump into a couple players to watch. We each have a couple players that we want to talk about before week 2. This is kind of a pseudo waiver wire before waiver wire show that if you have an extra spot on your bench or you have someone like Terry McLaurin or Travis Kelce's that's going to not play this week and you can put them on injured reserve and maybe pick someone else up on the bench, these are the guys to do it. So Ben, who's the first guy for you that you're kind of keeping an eye on before week 2?
It's not really guy, it's more so guys. And I know you'll talk about this more in a second. But if there are any rookie wide receivers that are on your waivers, or even after week 1, where guys are panicking, Travis Kelce may not play, Cooper Kupp may not play, I need to drop somebody. You're not dropping. Sorry about that, folks. Technical difficulties, but you're not going to be dropping Travis Kelce or Cooper Kupp. You're just going to move them to the IR. And what you'll typically see is those rookie wide receivers are among the first that get dropped because they don't typically produce in the first 8 weeks of the season. And what we see is when you are planning your championship run this year, there is going to be at least one rookie wide receiver that everybody is like, man, I wish I got this guy in the end of my drafts. One of my favorite guys is Jordan Addison, but I also love Quentin Johnston. There's one other rookie wide receiver who's almost definitely on your waivers, and Alex is going to tell you why you need to be keeping your eye on him.
Yeah, it's got to be Marvin Mims. I mean, Marvin Mims right now on Yahoo platforms is not even on 40% of people's rosters right now, which is crazy to me considering the fact that the Broncos kept just 4 wide receivers on their 53-man roster. And one of them is Jerry Jeudy, who's most likely not even going to play for week 1, which gives a massive opportunity for Marvin Mims to be the wide receiver 2 or maybe even the wide receiver 1 as soon as the first week of the season. The Broncos traded up to get him in the draft. He had one of the best analytical profiles in all of high school, in all of college. I think Marvin Mims is super underrated and someone that I cannot be getting enough of. He'd be my first target. Who's the other guy for you right now on waivers that you're keeping an eye on before week 2?
Again, not guy, but guys. I think that the Rams backfield is going to be such a headache this year. And I think that once Cooper Kupp comes back and is healthy, this offense might show a little bit of firepower, especially in the receiving game. I project them to be down quite a bit this season just because of that defense. So we know that we're going to see a lot of targets to Cooper Kupp. But then when we talk about this backfield, everybody seems to be so high strung on Cam Akers. Let us remind you that Cam Akers was supposed to be cut last year. He stayed away from the team. They couldn't find a trade partner. It was only until Baker Mayfield, aka the running back whisperer, was the starting quarterback of the team, that Cam Akers was even relevant. He was rushing for over 100 yards per game, finished as the RB2 in that time frame. So Cam Akers, sure, there's some appeal to him, but I currently think that his ADP is too high. I'm not really too high on him for the season. Kyron Williams was very inefficient last year as a rusher, but could be decent as a pass catcher. Who knows? Don't forget that the team also went out and they drafted Zach Evans. He's almost definitely going to be on the waivers, but there's a really good chance that he gets involved in this offense at some point. And I just don't think Cam Akers is it. I really don't. I don't think there's any reason to believe Cam Akers is it. This team does not like Cam Akers. Grab one of the other running backs instead.
Yeah. As the reverse to J.K. Dobbins that we talked about earlier in the show, I was very in on Cam Akers, and now I feel silly for believing in him. We saw a lot of reports, again, that have come out over the last couple of weeks about how they plan to use that backfield, and they have not been positive about Cam Akers like they should be. You talked about it a lot. It seems like they want to get other guys involved, and Cam Akers might not be the bell cow or the workhorse that we kind of hoped that he would. And it's so disappointing that we can't, because I would love to see Cam Akers unleashed just one time, but unfortunately not. The mega deep player that is almost definitely not on your fantasy football team that you should be going after right now is Evan Hull for the Colts. Sorry, not Evan Hull for the Colts. I meant Zach Moss. Excuse me. Zach Moss got to be the guy that I'm in on the most. He's most likely not going to be playing in week 1. And if you have a waiver wire option this week, you should be putting it out for Zach Moss. I've seen a couple different things that have come out that are saying that once Zach Moss is back, he is going to be the starter for the Colts. Is that going to happen? Who knows? But they clearly do not seem to think that it's going to be Deion Jackson or Evan Hull. They think it's going to be Zach Moss. And with this whole Jonathan Taylor situation playing out right now, and the fact that he could come back in week 4, week 5, but he could also be traded. We don't know if he's actually going to play, even though it would make a lot of sense for him to play. There's a real chance that you could get Zach Moss right now, who's owned in less than 10% of leagues, and he could end up being the Colts starter for the entire season. So if you have an IR spot, or you have just a spare bench spot where you could put a potential starting running back, the offense is ugly, but anytime you can get a starting running back, I'm willing to do it. I think Zach Moss could be that guy.
Anytime you can get a starting running back, it is definitely worth it. However, this offense, you just mentioned that Anthony Richardson's passing touchdown line was 17.5. However many the team rushing touchdown total is, you got to imagine at least a third of that is going to go to Anthony Richardson. And then this backfield just projects to be a mess between Hull and Moss and Jackson. Yes, I know Moss is going to be the one. Alex, we're going to have to disagree on this one. I don't want any piece of this backfield. I don't want to be putting a guy who's going to get 7 points per game and might lose snaps to Deion Jackson in my backfield.
Yeah, that's fair. I think I'm still willing to get volume, especially as we're going to probably see more injuries. It's a long season. We're going to have to find people to fill in. I think that Zach Moss could be somebody to fill in. Again, worst comes to worst, you put him on your IR spot and you take him off after this week when nothing happens. But best case scenario, you can put a free guy on your bench for those leagues that have the injured reserve spot and kind of see what happens. But again, fair points about the backfield. But again, we'll be back every single Wednesday, the entire season, at 1 p.m. to give you everything you need to know for each week in fantasy football, covering all the different ins and outs and everything you could possibly think about. But until next time, don't forget to subscribe and tune in to more 33rd Team goodness coming out each and every single day throughout football season.